Okay, recording.
Hi.
We didn't workshop that bit. Okay,
No, we
start again.
didn't. Hello, virtual Jane Con.
Hello,
So I'm Sharmini, and
I'm Kelly
yes, and we're going to be talking about crime in Jane
in
Austen's England.
Jane Austen's time. And one of the reasons we've been thinking so much about this for the last few years, actually, is that we have written a book called, a novel, obviously, called Miss Caroline Bingley, Private Detective, and that'll be out in April next year. So we've been thinking about the concept of um, real crime particularly in London, uh, in that era, but also what's been done with Jane Austen's characters and books in the crime fiction world particularly the last few decades.
Yeah. So it's something we've researched heavily, and it was such a chore to have to read all those books.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
wasn't a chore. It's been fun. It's been fun.
And it's sure to, think, as many of you know, to think about Austen and her characters a lot
A lot.
for many, many months, and laugh a lot at, her words and her jokes, and then uh, desperately try to make something that does it justice.
Hmm.
But before we start, we should acknowledge that we are both working and living on unceded land, in Melbourne in particular. Sharmini, I'm assuming that you
Yes,
are on the
I
traditional
am
lands.
of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, so I'd like to pay my respects to them.
Yeah, and I often am, but at the moment I'm in New Zealand and I'm on the country. Well, actually, I'm on an island, and tangata whenua here is Ngāti Pāroa. So my respects to their people and my acknowledgement of their continuous cultural connection to country, and to this beautiful island where I'm lucky enough to be today.
We should also say that we are going to touch on obviously with crime, there are some themes that can be unpleasant for some people. Obviously, death comes into it, and other sort of criminal activities that Kelly will go into. So make sure you look after yourself.
Yeah.
If anybody's also got kids who are watching, we will talk about more mature themes around sexuality too.
And we also want to thank everybody involved in the virtual Jane Con. It's such a cool event, and we're delighted to be part of it this year
Thank you.
and beforehand. Before.
Yes.
All right, let's go.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to share my screen.
That was a lot of preamble.
It was a preamble.
Prelude. Who loves a prelude?
Bach loved a prelude. Jane Austen, Crime in Jane Austen's England, Facts and Fictions. And Kelly's going to do all the facts and I'm going to do all the fictions, sort of.
Yeah,
Yep.
but who knows? Somebody could interrupt at any time.
At any minute, anything could
Yeah.
happen. It's wild.
All right, so let's talk a little bit first, though, about crime in Georgian England in Austen's lifetime and a little bit after her lifetime, which was, as we all know, unfortunately short. Um, One of the most, I suppose, memorable and most sort of infamous things about crime and the justice system at that time is that you could be hung for almost anything, especially offences against property. So there's this huge number of 18th century statutes that specified death, particularly hanging, as the penalty for just even minor property offences. And this was called the Bloody Code. And by the time Jane Austen came into the world, there were 220 capital offences on the books. So arson, for example, the crime of arson was a capital offence, and the definition of arson was expanded to include the new crime of burning haystacks or even just threatening to burn haystacks. We'll talk a little bit more about why that happened, but I'm pretty sure that you can guess. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those hanging offences, because this is the context in which a lot of the crime fiction that people have written with Austen's characters, or indeed with Austen as a character afterwards, are concerned with some of these offences, because they make the stakes in crime fiction so incredibly high, even for what we would now consider minor offences. So all of these things, from a simple theft or pickpocketing, to embezzlement, things that they might be felonies now, and this is where the idea of the felony came into existence, were actually capital offences. And hangings were a big public spectacle. They were held initially at Tyburn in London, and then later outside Newgate Prison. And at their execution, convicts were given a chance to speak to the crowd, with the idea that they would confess their sins, but very often they didn't, because very often they hadn't actually sinned very greatly, before they were hanged. And a lot, as you can see from this list, a lot of this framework was class-based and designed to preserve the social order of the time. So petty treason, for example, was an offence in which a person killed or simply violated the authority of somebody superior to them in the social order, not the king. If you did it to the king, it was treason, but doing killing or even just insulting somebody who was a public servant, perhaps a magistrate, or simply your social superior, was considered petty treason. And so that was a capital offence. Theft could be something from cattle or sheep rustling to breaking into someone's house to steal some silverware, or it simply could be grabbing a loaf of bread from a basket or a stall as you were passing. I'm sure we're all familiar with the cultural representations of pickpockets, like in Oliver Twist, most famously perhaps. And that could be as simple as just grabbing someone's purse or some coins out of their pocket, perhaps their fob watch, or even just a handkerchief. It didn't matter really what you stole. The act of stealing, the act of committing an offence against somebody's property, and that property being on their person, whether you were a pickpocket or a cut purse, could get you into really serious trouble. And cut purses and pickpockets were all over London. That's why they're in so many of the stories, not so much Austen's, but plenty of the other literature written at the time and since about that time. London, they were like the curse of the major cities, but particularly London, and in crowds such as at the opera, milling about to go inside the theatre in Covent Garden, you were at your most vulnerable. We also note there that sodomy, which is basically the crime of being a homosexual man, but it could be extended to all sorts of other people. Sodomy was a label also applied to lesbians at that time. That too was a capital offence until 1861, but the last executions for those people who were guilty of the crime of sodomy, and they were homosexual men, took place in 1835. Women and children could also be executed and later transported. And so one of the things that happened, particularly with these common crimes that were hanging crimes, but were often commuted. The sentences were often commuted. People had a bit of discretion, or the judges had a bit of discretion for a while, at least. Is a lot of them were commuted to transportation once the penal colonies were set up, firstly in America, or at least until the Revolutionary War, and in places like Australia and Norfolk Island. So every Australian kid has grown up being taught in school about kids who were transported to the colonies for the theft of a few slices of bread or a handkerchief. And they might get transported for 8 years or 10 years to the other side of the world, which was basically an exile for the rest of their lives. So those sorts of petty thieving things were very common, of course, but one of the most common and most serious to the government crimes was smuggling, because almost everyone smuggled or used smuggled goods, whether it was tea or fabric or hard liquor or even cheese brought in from the continent in particular. And there were two things going on, particularly in Austen's time. There were people trying to avoid paying the import duties on the goods, but there was also a lot of years, many years, where there was a blockade of products being brought over from France while the war was on with Napoleonic France, and so the smugglers were also trying to avoid the blockade, and people were trying to get their hands on French cheese and then eat it privately while nobody could see. But it was one of those things that everybody knew how to get stuff from the black market if they needed to, even very respectable people.
Like Jane Austen.
Like Jane Austen and the Austen family.
Yeah, whose brothers were in the Navy and therefore had access to ships that were less likely to be scrutinised.
That's right. I'm the granddaughter of a wharfie, and come from a community, a wharf-focused community, working class community, and what they always used to say was that fell off the back of a truck. And we all had straw hats that had apparently fallen off the back of the truck. So it's not it probably doesn't fall out of container shipments very often, but anymore. But yeah, so it was very common in especially my mother's lifetime, but particularly common and not really remarked upon very much in Austen's lifetime. But what was remarked upon were those really annoying and often quite infamous sorts of criminals like footpads, pickpockets, cut purses, and of course, highwaymen. So you can see from most of these crimes that many of the crimes against property, were actually crimes of poverty, or like with the burning of the haystacks, that were about rising up against authority. And that's one reason that the highwaymen became so famous. They weren't necessarily Robin Hood types distributing their money, but they disrupted the aristocracy. They disrupted the status quo, and they made the aristocracy in particular very nervous. So they became folk heroes, and we've all heard the ballads or seen read the novels and seen the shows, even most recently Renegade Nell, which I loved. Again, a lot of those figures that come up in the Austen-like fiction. So that was the whole, that's a glimpse, I suppose, into the criminal world, particularly in London. And then there was the class of people who were trying to police this world and bring some of these people to what they thought of as justice. So it's the early days of the development of policing. In London in particular, the first sort of police forces were things like the Bow Street Runners. There were all sorts of other private arrangements that people made. Outside London, you had parish constables in different places with like communities within the big cities or villages, you might have night watchmen, and a lot of those people were volunteers. You also had a class of private police force, if you like, or criminal trackers down called thief takers. And they, if you were lucky, would catch somebody who had committed a crime against you, but actually they were quite often criminals themselves. And they even had, many of them had this whole racket where they stole things themselves and then dobbed in somebody else. So they got the stolen goods that they had stolen, and then they got the reward for dobbing somebody else in, because it was pretty hard for somebody who was put into the justice system, arrested, thrown into the prison, to then get out of the justice system, even if they were innocent. And of course, many of these people, from jailers to magistrates, could be and were bribed. So we often have this idea, perhaps from movies, about the order of the courtroom at that time. But this is an actual courtroom scene. This is one of William Hogarth's um, prints. And in this is what the courts were mostly looked like. People loved going to court cases almost as much as they loved going to execution. So they would be crammed, standing up into this tiny little room. And here in this engraving, we've got the accused behind the bar begging the magistrate for mercy, and his weeping mother behind. But the partner in crime here is swearing on the Bible as he gives evidence against the accused. And so the outlook for this person does not look good. We don't know what his crime was, but if it was a hanging offence, things were going to go pretty badly for him.
I love that
But
the judge is just like, I've had it.
yeah, whatever. I'm tired. It's
Yeah.
time for lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, lounging about.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of judges, of course, took their duties very seriously, and a lot of magistrates and justices of the justices of the peace took their duties very seriously. And the Bow Street Runners were actually started by someone who was both a magistrate and also a novelist, Henry Fielding, who wrote the history of Tom Jones. It's one of the great picaresque novels, before Austen got her hands on the form of the novel. But in this next slide, we have another print, which is, it's actually a painting by John Colet of a shoplifter being discovered stealing lace under her skirts. And this brings us to an incident, a criminal incident that happened in 1879 when Mrs. Jane Lee Perrott was arrested for stealing lace worth 20 shillings. So that was a capital offence at that time. She was arrested in a shop in Bath, but she was a wealthy woman. So instead of being held in the lockup for months, she was able to be accommodated with her husband in the prison keeper's house next door to the prison. In March of the next year, she was tried at the Taunton Assizes and accused of grand larceny. So very serious offence, but she was acquitted. She had, however, incurred considerable legal. I think I just muted myself, sorry. Can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I leaned on the mute button.
That's okay. We've all done it.
Yep. She would have incurred considerable legal expense and probably quite a few bribes, and would have had to pay for her accommodation in the prison keeper's house all that time. But she escaped the death penalty, and other people who were sentenced at that same session were sentenced to death for similar level crimes. Now, the reason we're telling you about this one is that Mrs. Lee Perrott was Jane Austen's aunt, and Miss Austen spent several months trying to avoid her aunt and uncle after this event, as did most of the polite society in Bath. But eventually they came for a cup of tea and she couldn't avoid them any longer because politeness overcame her.
He overcomes everything.
That's right.
Oh, you said 1860. Did you mean 17? The year
The year was 1799,
1799. Yeah,
and she was tried in March 1800.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So I think I might have misheard. All good.
That's okay. So so one of the things about all these crimes that were going on is that people knew about them, and we certainly know that Austen knew about them, and her family knew about them, and crimes that were famous were discussed in the letters and discussed, at over tea all the time, because there was an awful lot of reporting, awful lot of writing about the crime that was going on, the real crimes that were going on. People were publishing, like the Ordinary of Newgate, who was the chaplain, was publishing people's speeches before they were executed. That was one of the perks of his job, that he could make vast amounts of money from publishing other people's words as they were dying. And there were scandal sheets and pamphlets and the early forms of novel about crimes, or in novels in which crimes occurred. And so if you think that the pamphlets were like a slightly more lurid version of Lady Whistledown, everybody knew about the crimes that were going on, and the character of the accused, and the character of the victims, and all of that sort of stuff. It was the early days, really, of tabloid publishing. So although crime doesn't feature prominently in any of Austen's novels, there are certainly hints of corruption, breaches of contract, and of course, Catherine Morland's imaginary murders. But I'm sure you can think of actions that usually occur offstage in Austen that might have resulted in criminal or civil proceedings for those characters. Wickham, for example, might have been apprehended for the abduction of Lydia Bennet, or the attempted abduction of Georgiana Darcy. Um, Certainly, there are a few characters like Tom Bertram who committed public drunkenness. John Thorpe nearly kills half of Bath with his carriage driving. Sir Thomas Bertram is profiting from the slave trade years after its abolition. And Willoughby could have been forced under the Poor Law to provide for Eliza had Colonel Brandon not stepped in. Poor Mr. Rushworth would have had to take Henry Crawford to court for what was then called criminal conversation with Maria Bertram in order to be granted a divorce. Divorces uh, didn't go to trial at that point, but the criminal conversation trial was a civil trial in which all the dirty laundry would be reported and would be introduced as evidence, and then reported in lurid detail in the tabloids. But of course, the most overt Austen writing about crime doesn't happen in her pages, but in those novels that came afterwards. And I'll hand over to Shamini now.
Okay, so we're going to talk about fictions, or after all those facts, some fictions, and there is a lot. There is a lot to cover. I'm not even going to attempt to suggest that what I've done is a sort of comprehensive survey of what's out there, but to give you just a few thoughts about the sort of categories that I'm thinking of when I think about the way that people adapt Austen or the Regency period for crime novels, and what that sort of tells us about Austen, weighs into Austen, what it tells us about the period, what it tells us about the way we think about the period and novel writing, and so on. So that's the caveat of what I'm going to say to start with. Crime novels as a genre are kind of like set in that period. There's a few, but I just wanted to particularly mention this one, which is by Alison Goodman, relatively new, and there is a second book coming out next year, because it's one of the few, I think, that sort of hews quite closely to an Austen-esque style, but actually having nothing to do with Austen specifically. So there's no specific mention of Austen or Austen's characters, or specific kind of attempt to directly tie it in, but it's a straight up crime novel that features women in the Regency period. Whereas lots tend to be either Austen or kind of quite different and sort of not drawing on Austen at all. This one sort of, I feel like, is great. Plus, Kelly and I know Alison, and she's great, and it's a good read. So,
And it's got a dashing highwayman as well.
there's a dashing highwayman in it. Yes, yes. Who? Yes. Oh, there's there's crime all over the place. It's great. Very cozy crime novel, and highly recommended. But then there's a sort of genre of crime novels as a background to romance in the genre. And I do want to hat tip a friend of mine, Kirsty, whose Instagram handle is there, for helping me with this, because it's not a genre that, well, it's a genre I read, but not as extensively. So for some extra help in this, I just wanted to thank her. But crime as a background to the romance genre works really well in this era, because so many, you've got the dashing highwaymen, you've got all kinds of things, and you can sort of set that as a background for your romance. If you want something a little bit on the queer side, KJ Charles' novels about the secret lives of country gentlemen, a lot of their novels are queer novels, but some of them are set in the Regency, and some of them involve crime, not just the crime of being gay, but other crimes as well, property crimes, and smuggling, and what's the one where you steal animals? Sorry, poaching. There's often gems and things like that involved. So that's one. These ones, as you can tell from the cover, historical accuracy is not necessarily the thing that people are most concerned about, but novels, spying. We didn't specifically mention that, but that comes under treason, right? So you if you're spying for another country, or if you're spying for your country, then you could be arrested for treason in another country, if that makes sense. And so spies are always fun, like double identities. And I believe that Lord and Lady Spy is a Regency retelling with spies of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the movie. So yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And I believe there's a whole series of these ones. Okay, now we get coming on to the crime ones, because often with crime fiction, you kind of want somebody to be solving the crime, whose job it is to be solving the crime, or who has some connection to being able to right the wrong, or sort of have the authority to set right what was done wrong by the crime. You want some sort of resolution that involves a kind of justice, or semblance of justice, anyway. And so there are series of novels, as there are, I guess, in contemporary fiction about policemen, of Bow Street runners of the time. So these novels, again, as you can see, historical accuracy not necessarily the most the thing that's uppermost in people's minds, as they're certainly designing the covers. But
Yes,
both
the accuracy of the cover might not be a representation of the text,
No,
accuracy in the
absolutely.
text.
True. Sorry, I take that. Yes, I should have said the accuracy of the covers is not necessarily a representation of the accuracy of the text. And some of these are very concerned about historical accuracy, and some of them use the setting more for the aesthetic, shall we say. And that will depend on different authors. Kate Bateman's quite, can I say, meticulous about period details. But yes, so Bow Street runners were sort of the forerunners of policemen. And so you've got somebody who in there who has at least some authority to solve crime, in theory, some familiarity with the criminal world, that serves as a plot driver, and also as a romantic figure. So there are a few series of novels about Bow Street bachelors, Bow Street runners, who happen to be bachelors and often happen to be very wealthy men as well, because
Why not? Why not?
yes, that's right. Because why not? Also, again, the cover is interesting for a Regency era novel. Lisa Kleypas. These are older books from the 90s, I believe. Again, about Bow Street runners. And for people who are more into Christian fiction, this is the Christian and sort of quote unquote clean fiction. Again, Regency era Bow Street runners, kind of men solving the mystery and having that authority, and the physique presumably that goes along with it. But I quite like the dress in this one, actually. So that's crime and romance. And then we get, that sort of ties into the Bow Street runners, sort of ties into what I was saying about crime and crime catchers. Because in order to have a crime novel, you have to have somebody to catch the criminal. Otherwise, that's a different kind of novel, I guess. It's not a crime genre novel. And as I'm sure many of you know, one of the most famous crime catchers, Sherlock Holmes, was a much later creation. And by the time Sherlock Holmes has come along, you have a much more established police force. You have a slightly more orderly justice system, and a process for people to go through, so that Sherlock Holmes can be sort of adjacent to those figures of authority. He can solve the crimes, and you get this sense of passing that on to what's his name? Lestrade?
Mm-hmm.
Lestrade. To sort of deal with the criminals in ways that are satisfying for justice, but don't sort of necessarily arouse quite the same feelings of injustice that we think about when we think about the hanging offences, and people being transported for a loaf of bread, which, yes, I was taught that in primary school, that's what happened, and that's how Australia was quote unquote founded, and that's a fun, enduring myth. So obviously, there was writing about crime before Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and there was crime taking place in fiction, and there were even sort of those narratives that we kind of think of as the crime novel. But obviously, Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes really popularized that genre, and it happened at a time that really coincided with a change or changes in the way that crime was being treated in the broader society, so that it became less of a private kind of dealt with at a very local level, at a sort of case-by-case basis, and in theory became something that was more kind of overarching, and there's an official police force, that there is an official kind of process for the way things are dealt with, at least in theory. And I think that is really important when we think of the development of the crime genre, particularly the cozy crime genre, that means that everything's kind of wrapped up neatly, that everything kind of ends happily for at least the key people in our story, that these are things that developments in the justice system that happen slightly later. So when we think about writing crime fiction back in Austen's time, one of the things that we're doing is creating that sense out of a system that was perhaps actually much more chaotic and much less kind of just, or not that I'm saying that things are completely just now, or even at any point, but that we're sort of imposing a level of order back onto something that was much more chaotic and much less regulated than what it actually was.
Yeah. Even the whole idea of a detection process, which is the basis of the crime, a lot of crime fiction, didn't exist. So you either got caught doing the thing, or somebody dobbed you in, or somebody put up a reward and somebody else claimed the reward by giving you up. Um, there weren't detectives as such
Yes,
in real
particularly.
life. So what we're doing when we write crime fiction is we're sort of retrofitting our understanding now of what detection and detectives mean to a time where it kind of didn't really
Yeah.
exist.
Sorry, yes, that's right. So the police force didn't exist as we know it. They weren't called policemen and they weren't police officers until later in the 19th century. And detectives, it wasn't a word that was used either for private people, private detectives wasn't a word that was used. So even when we use it for Caroline Bingley, it's anachronistic, but it really describes, the detecting of what she's doing.
Yeah.
We like to think she invented the phrase and just handed it on.
I mean, coroners who were just like local guilds people and magistrates did try to figure things out, but they didn't have the understanding that we have, or even the
No.
understanding that
And there wasn't sort of
Wilkie Collins.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, there wasn't the same sort of expectation that they would have that capacity, or that they would apply those skills in ways that we think of. We're so saturated in CSI and, well, even Sherlock Holmes, that sort of looking for clues in those ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's moving on. So we tend to associate crime in England much more with Dickens than we do with Austen. And that's not to say that there wasn't heaps and heaps of crime actually happening in Austen's milieu. But I'm just kind of wanting to point out that the way we think of those time periods in England is very much shaped by the authors that we associate with them. So we think of Austen and we think of the Regency period, and we think of Bridgerton and we think of Austen, and we think of the crimes being sort of crimes of passion or crimes of sort of manners. Even though, as Kelly's pointed out, there were heaps and heaps of other kinds of crime going on, and the heaps and heaps of punishments of crimes going on. But we tend to think of a lot of those things as being much more Victorian in sort of when they became more prominent, which is not necessarily true. So yes, there was an urbanization process that happened much more with the ongoing industrial revolution, and then you end up with much more poverty in London, and therefore different types of crime. But I think a lot of the way that we look at crime in the 19th century is very much influenced by the fiction that we read about it, and the most common types of fiction that we associate with different ages. So it's just worth pointing out, I think, that Austen makes us kind of have this a little bit of a fantasy idea that most of us probably know if we were to think about it a bit, that everything was sort of ordered and genteel and correct in that time period, and that crime became much more of a thing towards the middle of the century with Dickens. But it's just it's not true. But it's worth, this is just another thing to go along with Kelly's illustrations, that the way that the media portrays things, with the darkness and the back alleys and the kind of, this is obviously later because you've got the policeman standing, policeman in the uniform. I think this might have actually been one of the illustrations of somebody coming across one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. So it's something we think of as a later phenomenon, but wasn't necessarily.
They did have penny papers in the Regency era.
Yes, but yeah, they did.
But it would have been all text.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this one actually was a Jack the Ripper one with the
Yeah.
policeman's. Yeah, so Crime at Austen. As Kelly has said, her life was not untouched by crime herself, with her aunt and the shoplifting thing, and her own family quite possibly being involved in a little bit of light smuggling to avoid some import taxes on things, quite possibly. But I just wanted to look briefly at some of the crime novels, other than ours, because no spoilers, that have been written specifically touching on Austen's world and Austen's work and Austen's characters and Austen herself. So the first, yes, the questions I want to just briefly consider these through. What can Austen tell us about crime, and what does crime tell us about Austen? Crime kind of is one of those things that acts as a very powerful kind of story engine. And it gives us very powerful kind of motivations in characters, a revealer of different characters' personalities, their motivations, their flaws, and their strengths. So it's a genre that lends itself to the dramatic, obviously, but also to kinds of examinations of people's inner worlds, as well, if that's what people want to use it for. So I want to just kind of look at a few examples and talk through those. Again, as I say, this is not exhaustive, and I've stuck to period kind of ones, and there's obviously so many Austen adaptations that I do not have time to go into today. The first set of examples are by Stephanie Barron, and this is just one of her novels, and there's a whole series. And this is actually a little bit different because Jane Austen is actually the detective in these. She does remind me a little bit of Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote, because she happens upon these crimes everywhere she goes, that it's to a level that you start to get a bit suspicious. I would start to get suspicious of the number of murders that are following Jane Austen around. If this were real, obviously it's not. Stephanie Barron kind of weaves into the novels kind of contemporaneous events like Waterloo and other political events and house parties. And one of the pleasures of these novels is reading through the timeline of Austen's life in terms of describing, what she's publishing and what novel she's revising, and kind of getting into her head in that way. And I think that's one of what these books are kind of doing, is really playing with Austen as a character and delving into what does it mean for Austen's sharp intellect that she applies to wit and to character and to writing. What if that were applied to the solving of crime? And she solves them all.
Of course she does.
Of course she does. Of course, and of course she would. Yeah, but I will say I still think it's a bit suspicious. There's like 20 of them. There's a lot of murders.
I know, but how many years has Midsummer Murders been running, and how many murders can there possibly be in one village?
This is true. This is very true.
You just have to suspend disbelief.
You do have to suspend disbelief, and they're a fun read. These are more recent novels by Tirzah Price. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Pride and Premeditation, and there's 2 sequels at least at the present time, and they're probably a more young adult kind of target. These ones are a little bit different. So they're set in the Regency period. They are retellings of the Austen novels, but they then also involve murder and other forms of crime, smuggling, and other things like that too. So they're really fun. And I think the kind of way into these is to kind of say, well, what if we shook up the Austen plot? We took the characters and shook up the Austen plot and threw a murder in there, so that the driving force is not just the inheritance and not just the social necessity or the economic necessity of getting married, but also a murder. I would say that personally, without spoilers, I did find it relatively easy to guess who done it, but that doesn't make them any less fun. So yeah, these ones, yeah, fun, YA, but murdery. And it does have a lot of the heroines acting as lawyers, detectives, things like that. So
Fantastic.
Not specific. Well, fantastic in lots of ways. There's a bit of a fantasy element to it, but not in a sort of supernatural fantasy way. Many of you will be familiar with Death Comes to Pemberley, which I kind of think of as a sort of the sequel, the sequel to Pride and Prejudice, because it really is about what happened after the book, but also with a murder. What happens to, what is Darcy and Elizabeth particularly, what is their relationship like? And then what is it like when it's stressed with a murder? not just stressed with, Lydia coming to visit and all the demands of family and all that kind of stuff, but specifically with the murder. And I've obviously picked the cover that was a tie into the BBC TV series, just because I particularly I do love her, but I've just temporarily forgotten her name, that actress.
Anna Maxwell
Hannah
Martin
Smith.
Smith. Uh,
No?
Anna Maxwell with a hyphen. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so this one is attempting to stay faithful, I think, to the Austen characters and to the Austen vibe and to what it is, not to change it up or fantasize about what if it were different, but actually just as a continuation, but with a key driving stressor being what if there's a murder in the household.
One of the things that James did, though, from memory, it's a couple of years since I read it, was the language is quite modern, isn't it? She's not attempting a Regency voice.
Not a Regency voice, but I feel like the characters in terms of their behavior, maybe,
Yep.
feel
Sensibilities. Yep.
sensibilities feels appropriate to Austen and the time, and
Yep.
there's not really a kind of 21st century, or maybe a more modern voice, but not really so much the feminist sensibility that I think you get
Mm-hmm.
in somebody like Tirzah Price. Yeah, if that makes sense. So yes, that's a good distinction in terms of the language versus the sensibility. I think that some things are just wish fulfillment.
Fan service, you might say.
Fan service, yes. All of
I
our
mean,
wish
who's
fulfillment.
not going to buy a book with that
I'm just
title?
saying. I'm just saying. Sometimes I think, and I think this actually carries over to the next one I want to talk about as well. That sometimes we want to see a resolution that we want to see, and so I think this comes into it. But also this one too, Murder at Mansfield Park takes the story of Mansfield Park, and obviously there's a murder, but it also takes the opportunity to change up the characters a lot. And as I'm sure that many of you know, Mansfield Park is, I would say it's a controversial Austen novel, but it brings out a lot of strong feelings, particularly about the heroine and some of the other characters. And this one really feels to me like somebody said, I did not like this character. I'm going to write her exactly the way I saw her in my mind. And we're going to see what happens from there. And if it's a murder, well, that's not my fault. Is that a fair summary?
I think so. And I think, I mean, some of the turnarounds are just hilarious.
Yeah.
Mrs. Norris is nice, for example. And so it's just
Oh,
funny.
it's just,
So
yeah.
anybody who knows the text really is just going to enjoy that. And then I think there are, my wishful thinking is about the Crawfords being,
Yes.
lovely,
Yes.
and 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 yeah, and so she twists almost everybody to
Yes.
their opposite,
Yeah.
including Fanny Price.
But I feel like my feeling is that she started with Fanny Price and the Crawfords and then went, well, if we're changing them all up, we'll just all of them. What if Mrs. Norris was nice? So Kelly, before we finish up, I did want to ask you if you had any thoughts about what our book with, obviously I've tried to avoid spoilers for all of these books. So without spoilers for ours, what kind of, I mean, I guess I do know what drew us to it. But what sort of we're trying to say about Austen and what we're trying to say about crime.
Um,
Sorry, everybody, I just threw this at Kelly without telling her.
well, I was thinking when you were talking before about the characters and um, especially the books about Austen and her intellect. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is just um, Caroline Bingley being so vivid on the page, um, and wondering what she would do after Elizabeth has married Darcy, and how she would feel about that, not just about the events, but about her own thoughts, her own expectations, what she imagined, the person she imagined she was. And we decided didn't we, that she would undergo a sort of a soul-searching process and decide that her education was inadequate and that she would go out into the world and educate herself and then apply. She was, in fact, a bit like those Austen novels, applying her superior intellect, as she would see it, to problems that crop up, which happen to be crime. But I think we are, obviously we are, as I'm sure all of these authors are, and their readers, always paying tribute to Austen and the incredible characters that she creates. The fact that she creates these people who live so vividly in our, not just in our minds, but in our lives, that people want to keep reinventing them or putting them into different situations or reimagining the characters altogether, as in Murder at Mansfield Park, is just, it's a body of work that is a tribute to her. The way that these events and everything else that people are involved in is a tribute to her. But one of the things that a lot of them do, and I think ours attempts to do, is break down that that divide between what was in fact a real divide between the rural life, rural genteel life, and the reality of life for poor people in London, in particular in London, but also in Manchester and Birmingham, and Liverpool, and other major cities that were undergoing this incredible transformation at the time. And that sort of merging of the rural genteel characters with the reality, the gritty reality of life in the big city that a lot of people in the Regency, no matter what their social standing was, were dealing with pretty much constantly, or worried about at least pretty much constantly, and certainly engaged with in all those forms of reporting that we talked about earlier.
I think that's one of the things also that I wanted to mention, is that Austen very much wrote to what she knew intimately and personally. And I think that's one of the reasons we don't get crime novels from her, is that that's not her experience. And we don't get novels about characters of different classes, and we don't get novels about characters of different races and all that kind of stuff, because she very much wrote to what she knew and gave us those stories. And I think for a lot of us, it's also about expanding that world to fill in some of the blanks outside of the, 2 inches wide piece of ivory that she wrote, to bring those characters across that whole spectrum as well. And I just sort of picking up on what Kelly was saying as well. I love that you can still write, Mariah Crawford. Sorry, not Mariah Crawford.
Mary
Crawford. Why would you name Mariah and Mary in the same book?
Oh, well, we've got plenty of Elizabeths and Janes.
Oh, I know, that's also true. Sorry, Mary Crawford. You can write her differently, but she's still Mary Crawford. Yeah, and that's part of the genius of Austen, of course, as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I want to finish up with, is the idea of Austen giving us through her characters a way into crime, because I can think of the characters that I know who would definitely be more lenient on crime, the ones that would be involved with smuggling, that would turn a blind eye to the poaching, all of that stuff. It gives us a way to sort of understand her characters better, but also crime, kind of throwing crime into the mix of a story about Austen characters gives us a great kind of way to expand those characters and give us something new. And that's what lots of authors have tried to do. It's what we've tried to do, and what we've tried to discuss today. Shall I stop sharing? Is that my cue to stop sharing?
Sure.
So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to the virtual JaneCon team, Bianca and the whole team. And we'll see you online.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the sessions as well.